Hello, my name's David Winch. I'm a chartered accountant and a director in Bartfields Forensic Accountants. Today in this webinar, we're going to look at responding to the prosecutor's Section 16 statement in confiscation. So let's have a look at the agenda. We're going to start with an overview of the implications of responding, or indeed not responding, to the prosecutor's Section 16 statement. Then look in more detail at the benefit of particular criminal conduct. Move on to the assumed benefit and other benefit, and then the available amount. Then we're quickly going to go into the amount required to be paid and talk a little bit about using expert witnesses and how Bartfields Forensic Accountants can help in confiscation proceedings. So let's crack on. Let's think a little bit about the defendant in all this. The defendant may still be sore about being found guilty, about being convicted, and indeed he may still be wanting to argue about that conviction. You might have to educate him into understanding that the confiscation proceedings are not an opportunity to argue again about whether he should or should not have been convicted. That's already been done and finished with. He may not understand the nature of confiscation, and he might be shocked at the figures in the Section 16 statement. As I said, you may need to educate him about what confiscation is, how it works, and what the implications are of both the benefit and the available amount. And there are particular issues, even more so at the moment with the pandemic. If the defendant is in prison, you may have additional difficulties in communicating with him. He may have difficulties in obtaining information. For example, if he wants to refer, if he's been in some sort of a business, if he wants to refer to business records, well, he's not going to have them with him in prison. So that's going to be an additional difficulty for him and for you. What's the position then? We've received the Section 16 statement with its assertions about the defendant's benefit and his available amount. And we are invited, if that's the right word, to respond, strictly speaking, under Section 17. But what if we have no response at all? What if there is just nothing filed in response to the Section 16 statement? Well, the danger is that could amount to contempt of court, because the Section 17 is an order of court requiring a response from the defendant. What are the implications of not disputing assertions which are in the Section 16 statement? The danger here is that the court may infer that the defendant accepts those assertions in the Section 16 statement to which he has not responded. Now, there's a limit on that. The court is not to regard that as the defendant agreeing to anything in relation to his benefit figures. A simple failure to respond to a benefit figure or an element of benefit isn't to be taken by the court as an agreement to that benefit figure. Where, on the other hand, the defendant expressly accepts in his Section 17 response something that is in the Section 16 statement, then the court can regard that as conclusive with regard to that particular matter. So just be careful that if you are actually agreeing to something, you may not have the chance subsequently to backpedal on that. But there is a saving in that this is not admissible in evidence in proceedings for another offence. So that if the defendant is admitting some benefit from some criminal conduct of which he's not being charged, that admission in a section 17 response is not admissible in evidence if he is subsequently charged with that offending and faces a new trial. So what I would suggest is that it may be appropriate, it may be best practice even, to respond paragraph by paragraph to each item in the section 16 statement with either an acceptance or a denial. Or if it's an item which it isn't possible to either accept or deny, then give a brief explanation as to why that is. And where matters are not accepted, then it is best to give reasons, of course, and supporting information and evidence if you have it, or to indicate that this is to follow. Sometimes some solicitors, some barristers do include a catch-all paragraph to the effect that the defendant denies each and every assertion in the section 16 statement, except to the extent that he expressly accepts matters in his section 17 response, just to sort of cover all, a catch-all, to say, if I haven't accepted it, then I'm denying it. For obvious reasons, the content of your section 17 response will depend very much on the content of the section 16 statement. And today, I'm not going to go through every possible assertion that there might be in a section 16 statement and the relevant case law and how one might respond to it. We would be here for 24 hours or more if I were going to do that. So I'm just going to touch on a few points in the relatively short time we have. It may be appropriate in the section 17 response to request further information from the prosecutor. Section 16 statements, some of them are very good, written by financial investigators who are very capable and knowledgeable about proceeds of crime legislation and so on. Some of them, frankly, are not so good. Sometimes there's a simple lack of appropriate evidence and information from the prosecutor for him to make his case. And in some ways, a badly prepared section 16 statement is more difficult to respond to than a well-prepared section 16 statement. So you may be saying in your section 17 response that you need the prosecutor to provide more information or more evidence in support of this, that, or the other. Okay, moving on. Let's look at the offence and the benefit of particular criminal conduct, or the particular benefit if you want. It might be the case, depending on what's on the indictment, that the amount of the defendant's benefit of an offence of which he's been convicted follows necessarily from the conviction. So, for example, if somebody is charged with stealing cash of £10,000 and convicted of that in the indictment, then the benefit of that offence is fairly obviously £10,000. Also, it may be that even where the benefit isn't spelled out in the indictment, that the judge in his sentencing remarks actually specifies exactly what he understands the defendant has been convicted of in terms of the benefit that's arisen. And so sometimes with the section 16 statement, you might be wanting to see that the judge's sentencing remarks so that you can consider the benefit of the offences. More commonly, perhaps, you may find that in the section 16 statement, we have for the very first time a quantification of the amount of the benefit which the defendant is alleged to have obtained. Particularly in drugs cases, we can see sometimes a benefit figure in a section 16 statement, which will come as news to the defendant, might come as something of a shock to the defendant. We will need to take extra care where, For example, there is more than one defendant being convicted. There might be issues there as to the role of this particular defendant and the benefit obtained by him, either solely or jointly. It may be that he's been convicted of an offence from which he's actually obtained no benefit at all. Or it might be, for example, he might be involved in a conspiracy with others. And then there's the question as to what was his role in that conspiracy. Let's say it's a conspiracy involving supply of drugs. What was his role in the conspiracy? To what extent did he obtain benefit? There might be benefit that's been obtained by the conspiracy and the conspirators as a body, which has not been obtained by this particular defendant. And if so, it shouldn't be included in his benefit of particular criminal conduct. So you can get involved in all these issues as part of the Section 17 response. Also, we need to be careful where there are valuations involved. Certainly we have valuations involving the supply of drugs, and we have to be careful where counts have been admitted on an accepted basis of plea. Now, there are two situations where you've had a basis of plea that's been accepted. It might have been accepted by the Crown for all purposes, including confiscation, or it might have been accepted for sentencing purposes, excluding confiscation. If it's been accepted for all purposes, then the confiscation proceedings have got to be consistent with that basis of plea. But if the Crown, when accepting the basis of plea, have specifically said that it's not accepted for confiscation purposes, then it's, well, as you would expect, it follows that the confiscation might be inconsistent with the accepted basis of plea. Also, be careful about counts that are left to lie on the file. The benefit of counts which are left to lie on the file does not form part of the defendant's benefit of particular criminal conduct because he's not been convicted of them. But they might form part of the benefit of his general criminal conduct under the statutory assumptions if he's got a criminal lifestyle. So we need to be a little bit careful about counts left to lie on the file. Of course, if there's a count of which the defendant has been actually acquitted, then he cannot have obtained any benefit, any criminal benefit from conduct in relation to that offence because he hasn't been convicted of it. He's been acquitted of it. So being expressly acquitted has different consequences from a count being left to lie on the file. Do remember that guilt of an offence may not necessarily involve the obtaining of any benefit. So if we've got, again, take a drugs case where we've got perhaps a courier, he might be convicted as a conspirator in the supply of drugs, but he may not have obtained any benefit in relation to those drugs because he was simply had possession of them on behalf of somebody else. Do be careful, I see this sometimes in Section 16 statements, of a prosecutor who extrapolates from the conviction. In terms of the benefit of particular criminal conduct, we are talking strictly about the benefit of the offence of which this defendant has been convicted. So take an example. John is found in possession of cocaine with a street value of, say, £2,000. You can see a Section 16 statement sometimes which will say something like, if that represents 1 week's sales and he's been selling for 2 years, then his benefit is 104 weeks at £2,000 a week. That's £208,000. So at the stroke of a pen, his benefit has increased from the £2,000 value of the drugs he was in possession of to £200,000 of benefit. But you've got to ask, well, what's the evidence? First of all, what's the evidence that John was supplying at street level? Does he have, the little bags, the scales, the cutting agent, all that sort of stuff? What's the evidence that these drugs that he had possession of were 1 week's sales rather than, let's say, 1 month's sales? And what evidence is there that shows that John's been trading at that level for 2 years? He might have started in a small way and built up slowly. And just because the indictment period might be 2 years long doesn't mean that he's actually been trading for 2 years. So in that sort of circumstance, you're going to be asking yourself and challenging the prosecution as to what is the evidence in support of their assertion of this benefit figure of £200,000. Okay, let's move on and look at assumed benefit. And this is perhaps the most difficult area in responding to a Section 16 statement. Obviously, assumed benefit and other benefit only relates to the situation where you have a defendant who has a criminal lifestyle. And there you're going to be looking at the definitions in Section 75, the criteria there to see if he actually meets those criteria and if he does have a criminal lifestyle. But let's assume for the moment that he does. Well, as I say, check that the defendant has, check that the prosecutor, has correctly identified that the defendant does have a criminal lifestyle, and also have a look at the relevant day. Only this week I've been looking at a Section 16 statement where the relevant day was based on the date on which the defendant had been arrested. And you will immediately recognise that it should have been based on the date on which the defendant was charged with the offence of which he's ultimately convicted, which leads to the confiscation proceedings, what we refer to as the offence concerned. So in that section 16 statement, the prosecutor had got the wrong relevant day. It was too early. It was too early actually by more than a year. And as a result, he got the wrong assumed benefit. So do check that. Of course, you will want to check the facts that are asserted in the Section 16 statement. For example, credits of amounts asserted to be made to a bank account, which is held solely or jointly by the defendant after the relevant day. You'll want to check that those credits actually occurred to a bank account that actually was in the name of the defendant solely or jointly, or if it wasn't in his name, that there's some other basis for saying that those are credits which went to or via the defendant. This is an area that we get involved in a great deal as forensic accountants, as you can imagine, going through bank statements, checking them, using our software to examine different bank accounts that the defendant has to see if money's just swapping from one to another and so on. Where the defendant is saying that what's alleged to be benefit of criminal conduct is in fact legitimate property, then you are going to need to produce evidence. It's not going to be accepted by the court, sad to say, that your defendant is a jolly good fellow and he wouldn't tell a lie. He needs some sort of corroborative evidence, not just his word that monies which he's received are from a legitimate source. So documentary evidence or other evidence of witnesses who are prepared to come to court for the confiscation proceedings to explain how they have given money to him or whatever, or bought property from him or whatever it is. Sometimes it is possible to infer that property is legitimate. For example, where you've got a pattern of weekly receipts, say every Friday, you might infer from that that these are weekly cash wages. Again, a lot of the time as forensic accountants, we are looking at patterns of transactions and we are saying, yeah, okay, one transaction in isolation doesn't prove anything, but when you look at this pattern, you can see that because of the regularity or or whatever it is, that this looks to be a particular type of income, a particular type of receipt, and that is legitimate. The prosecutor should have excluded from his benefit items such as transfers between the defendant's own bank accounts. Where that gets a little bit more tricky is where you have a defendant who says, well, actually, I took cash out of my account at one branch and I walked down the street and paid that cash into my account at a different bank. In my experience, it's not too difficult to persuade the Crown to accept that that is what happened if you've got a withdrawal and a deposit of the same amount on the same day. It gets more challenging if the amount withdrawn and the amount deposited are different, or if there's a gap of time, several days, let's say, between the withdrawal and the deposit. Because the suggestion from the prosecutor is going to be, well, actually, this defendant withdrew that cash in order to, let's say, buy drugs or whatever, and then he sold them, and then he's deposited the proceeds, and therefore the subsequent credit isn't merely a transfer, which wouldn't entail any benefit. It is, in fact, proceeds of crime. Look out for bounce debits where direct debits or whatever have not been paid because there's insufficient funds in the account and then they've been credited back on the bank statement. Sometimes the prosecutor will, as it were, run his finger down the credits and pick up those as assumed benefit. Well, clearly they're not assumed benefit. They're not genuine receipts at all. They're simply the reversal of a debit. And look for expenditure demonstrably funded from known sources. There is, of course, this assumed benefit in relation to expenditure incurred after the relevant day. But if you can show that that expenditure was funded from a known source, then that rebuts that assumption. And don't forget that the known source might be a legitimate source, or it might be an illegitimate source, which has already been taken into account under another head. So if you've got a defendant who's putting money into his bank account and that money going in is assumed to be benefit of general criminal conduct because it can't be explained, and then he withdraws that money and spends it, then that expenditure isn't a second benefit. It's simply the use of money which we've already taken into account in arriving at his benefit when it was paid in. So don't let the prosecution include expenditure like that as additional benefit, double counting the benefit under the assumptions. If the defendant's engaged in a legitimate trade and has made tax returns for income tax and VAT, then do be careful, because the figures that HMRC will produce are probably based on accounts, and the turnover, which is what we're looking at, the total sales value, if we're looking at credits to a bank account, we're saying the total sales value per those accounts is legitimate, but it's not simply the total sales value per the accounts. We have to add on the VAT, because that figure in accounts prepared for tax return purposes will exclude VAT, which the business has charged to its customers. So we need to ensure that the prosecutor has got the correct figures from HMRC. We're not looking at declared profits, we're looking at declared gross takings. And we need to ensure that we've got any VAT included, again, as legitimate funds. So if this defendant has banked, let's say, £120, then in terms of his accounts, he will have £100 in sales, excluding the VAT, and he will perhaps have a profit of £30. But it's the £120 which we have accounted for by way of legitimate income. So we've got to use figures of gross receipts inclusive of VAT as the legitimate income to be excluded from the assumed benefit of property transferred to the defendant. And also do remember the Supreme Court case of Harvey, which was actually a case I was involved in, where Mr. Harvey was operating a business which was not wholly legitimate, but he was charging VAT to his customers. And it was held by the Supreme Court that that VAT which he charged to his customers and accounted for to HMRC was not benefit. So it may be necessary to analyse assumed benefit between accounting years or between tax years in order to relate it back to figures in accounts or tax returns. Again, this is something that the forensic accountant can help you with. Where the prosecutor has included benefit from previous convictions or previous confiscation orders, do ensure that the prosecutor's figures are actually correct and that they're supported with appropriate evidence. And where any benefit is uplifted for changes in the value of money, the CPIH computations should be checked by you or again by your forensic accountant. It's useful, I think, to supply a table showing the benefit asserted under each head in the Section 16 statement and the Section 17 response. And I sometimes refer to these as a Scott schedule, which if you do civil law, you will have come across probably in that connection. Okay, let's move on to the available amount. Strictly speaking, of course, the burden is on the defendant to establish on a balance of probabilities that his available amount is less than his benefit. But in practice, the Section 16 statement will include information on the defendant's available amount. If the defendant considers any assets have been overvalued in the Section 16 statement, then an independent professional valuation should be obtained, and you should get legal aid to cover the costs of that. I'm a bit wary of just going to the local estate agent and getting a free valuation, because what that estate agent will be thinking is, this person is perhaps going to want to sell this property, and so I need to give a bullish figure for the value. Well, of course, in these proceedings, you don't want an excessive value. You want a realistic value of what might actually be achieved on a sale. You're also going to need up-to-date values for secured liabilities, like outstanding mortgages, and hopefully you're going to get a mortgage statement or a letter that you can put in with the Section 17 response as supporting evidence, because those liabilities, of course, need to be taken into account in arriving at the defendant's available amount. Where you've got third parties claiming an interest in assets, it might be appropriate, if you can, to get witness statements from those third parties and append them to the Section 17 response. Of course, there are particular difficulties where you've got husband and wife and so on, as to questions as to who's entitled to what. The big bugbear with available amount, of course, is tainted gifts and hidden assets. All I can really say at this point is that where you are disputing tainted gifts or hidden assets, you are going to need to provide full information in the Section 17 response. The difficulty you have is that if the defendant has made a gift, then whether or not it's a tainted gift normally relies solely on the date on which the gift has been made. Again, useful to have a summary table of the defendant's total available amount, comparing the Section 16 figures, Section 16 statement figures with the Section 17 response. Again, a Scott schedule, in other words. The recoverable amount, so-called, is the lower of the benefit and the available amount, and that we see in Section 7 of POCA. But what about the amount required to be paid? Well, the amount required to be paid will be the recoverable amount unless it would be disproportionate for an order to be made in that amount. And that's where we think about the case of weigher. So if that would be disproportionate in the weigher sense, because let's say some of the benefit obtained has actually been returned to the victim of the crime or whatever, then the amount required to be paid will be the largest amount, which would not be disproportionate. So what we're saying here is that a weigher adjustment, if I can call it that, on grounds of proportionality is not made to the benefit and it's not made to the available amount. It's made to the amount required to be paid. I've mentioned a few times expert witnesses, forensic accountants, and I would say that expert witnesses can be very useful in confiscation cases, particularly valuers. And I've seen the police, of course, have their own people who give valuations of drugs and will tell you about the quantities in which drugs are sold. I had a recent case in which somebody was using a machine to make amphetamine pills, and the police witness gave evidence that if the machine was operated for 14 hours a day, it could produce this many pills a week, and the value would be whatever. It's very useful to have a defense expert to have a look at those values, to challenge, if it's appropriate, the price per pill in this case. And also, in this particular case, the expert challenged whether that particular machine could be operated for 14 hours a day and could actually produce that value of drugs. And of course, forensic accountants get involved with a lot of this detail, particularly in assumed benefit cases. We use sophisticated software which helps us examine bank statements and compare different bank accounts together and so on, and to produce summaries by calendar year or tax year or whatever, depending on what's relevant in a particular case, what's relevant and useful. But I do recommend, of course I would, I do recommend forensic accountants be used particularly in criminal lifestyle cases. And legal aid is normally available to cover the cost of an expert witness report. So, how can we help? Well, I've mentioned all the various things that we as forensic accountants do in confiscation cases. We are fully staffed through the pandemic. We are undertaking legally aided and privately funded criminal and indeed civil forensic accountancy work. And fortunately for us, it is relatively easy for us to conduct the bulk of our work remotely using our up-to-date and secure IT facilities. We remain readily contactable by phone and email and online. And our website is full of very detailed information and articles. And of course, that's accessible 24/7. You can find more on this topic on our website. And this and previous webinars can be found again on the website using the link there. This particular webinar will be is being recorded and will be available on the website in 2 or 3 days. We shall also send you a recording of this webinar so that you can review it at your leisure. And if you've got questions, please email them in and we will do our very best to answer them. The email addresses are there. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I've taken a little bit longer than the 30 minutes we billed, but I hope it's time well spent. Thank you very much. Goodbye.